The valley of Dien Bien Phu stretched 12 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide across the mountainous northwest frontier of French Indochina, a natural basin surrounded by jungle-covered hills that rose nearly 500 meters above the valley floor, where French forces had established what military planners believed would become the decisive battlefield of the 8-year conflict that would determine whether European colonial power could survive the tide of communist revolution sweeping across Southeast Asia in the aftermath of World War II. General Henri Navarre's strategy for Operation Castor had transformed this remote valley into a fortress complex that housed over 16,000 French and French Union troops, whose mission encompassed luring Viet Minh forces into conventional battle where superior French firepower, artillery support, and air mobility could destroy General Vo Nguyen Giap's People's Army in decisive engagement that would break communist military capabilities while demonstrating French resolve to maintain colonial authority against nationalist insurgency supported by Chinese communist advisors and Soviet military assistance. The fortress positions bore code names that reflected French confidence in their defensive preparations: Gabrielle, Beatrice, Anne-Marie, Huguette, Françoise, Claudine, Eliane, and Dominique. Each strongpoint had been positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire while maintaining communication and mutual support that would allow French forces to channel Viet Minh assault forces into predetermined killing zones where concentrated artillery and automatic weapons fire could inflict casualties that would exceed communist replacement capabilities. Colonel Christian de Castries commanded the garrison from his headquarters bunker at the center of the defensive complex, coordinating artillery fire from 105mm and 155mm howitzers, whose range and accuracy were expected to provide French forces with decisive advantages over Viet Minh forces. Artillery capabilities were presumed limited to mortars and recoilless rifles that couldn't match French firepower in sustained bombardment operations that would characterize siege warfare in the confined valley terrain. The strategic context of the Dien Bien Phu operation reflected broader Cold War considerations that extended beyond French colonial interests to encompass American concerns about communist expansion in Southeast Asia and the potential for Chinese military intervention that could transform regional conflict into global confrontation. The Geneva Conference, scheduled for May 1954, would address Indochina's political future, but military outcomes at Dien Bien Phu would determine negotiating positions and influence whether communist forces could achieve political objectives through military victory. French intelligence assessments had underestimated both the scale of Viet Minh commitment to the Dien Bien Phu campaign and the logistical capabilities that General Giap's forces possessed for moving heavy artillery through mountainous terrain that French planners considered impassable for weapons systems whose weight and size exceeded what human porters could transport across jungle paths that lacked road networks or mechanized transportation infrastructure. The Viet Minh artillery positioned in the hills surrounding Dien Bien Phu included 105mm howitzers, 75mm recoilless rifles, and multiple rocket launchers whose firepower had been assembled through logistical operations that involved over 200,000 porters carrying weapons, ammunition, and supplies across mountain trails that covered hundreds of kilometers from Chinese border supply points to firing positions that provided commanding observation of the entire French defensive complex. Local Vietnamese folklore included traditions that provided cultural context for the supernatural events that would soon manifest in the valley, though these traditional narratives were dismissed by French military authorities whose colonial attitudes prevented serious consideration of indigenous spiritual beliefs that had sustained Vietnamese resistance to foreign domination for over a millennium. The valley's name derived from Vietnamese words meaning seat of the border county prefecture, but local tribal traditions included references to spiritual powers associated with the mountainous terrain. The Tai and Hmong ethnic minorities who inhabited the region maintained oral traditions that described supernatural warriors who appeared during times of foreign invasion to protect indigenous peoples against external conquest. These stories included detailed accounts of burning figures who emerged from jungle vegetation to engage foreign armies with weapons that combined traditional combat methods with supernatural capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations, while inspiring local resistance fighters with courage that transcended normal battlefield morale. French colonial ethnographers had documented similar legends from other regions of Indochina, where resistance to foreign rule had been sustained through spiritual beliefs that attributed military success to divine intervention rather than conventional tactical advantages. These accounts described luminous warriors whose appearance coincided with crucial battles where indigenous forces achieved victory against technologically superior invaders through supernatural assistance that enhanced combat effectiveness while providing spiritual inspiration. The mountainous terrain surrounding Dien Bien Phu contained numerous caves, tunnels, and underground chambers that local traditions identified as dwelling places for ancestral spirits whose protection could be invoked during times of crisis through appropriate rituals and offerings. French geological surveys had mapped many of these cave systems for potential military use, but hadn't investigated the cultural significance that indigenous populations attributed to underground locations that served spiritual as well as tactical purposes. Buddhist and animist religious practices prevalent among Vietnamese populations included beliefs about spiritual warriors who manifested during righteous conflicts to assist those defending their homeland against foreign aggression. These spiritual entities were described as appearing in forms that combined human characteristics with supernatural attributes, including immunity to conventional weapons and the ability to inspire fear in enemies while providing courage and tactical guidance to indigenous fighters. The French military medical services stationed at Dien Bien Phu included personnel whose training encompassed tropical diseases and combat trauma treatment, but who possessed no preparation for phenomena that would challenge materialist medical understanding while producing therapeutic and psychological effects that exceeded conventional treatment capabilities. The medical officers had documented various indigenous healing practices, but had dismissed them as primitive superstition rather than acknowledging therapeutic systems that incorporated spiritual dimensions of health and warfare. As dawn broke on March 13th, revealing clear skies that would provide excellent visibility for artillery observation while exposing French defensive positions to accurate Viet Minh fire from commanding heights that surrounded the valley like an amphitheater designed for maximum destruction, Colonel de Castries prepared his garrison for combat that would test every aspect of French military doctrine against an enemy whose capabilities and determination exceeded what colonial experience had prepared them to face. The French defensive strategy at Dien Bien Phu relied on coordinated artillery fire from battery positions that included 12 105mm howitzers of the 2nd Airborne Artillery Group, 4 155mm heavy guns that provided long-range fire support, and numerous 81mm mortars whose concentrated firepower was designed to break up Viet Minh assault formations before they could reach French perimeter positions. Captain Pierre Touré commanded the artillery coordination that would prove critical for maintaining defensive integrity against enemy forces whose numbers were estimated at over 50,000 troops positioned in the surrounding hills. The 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion occupied Strongpoint Beatrice on the northeastern perimeter, where Major Paul Pegot had positioned his 700 men in trenches and bunkers that provided protection against small arms fire while maintaining fields of fire that could engage attacking forces across the approaches from hills 674 and 701. The position's tactical significance derived from its role as the northern anchor of French defenses, but its isolation from the central command complex created vulnerability to coordinated assault that could overwhelm the garrison before reinforcements could provide effective support. Strong Point Gabriel, defended by the 7th Algerian Rifle Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Jules Gaucher, controlled the northern approaches to the airstrip, whose operational capability remained essential for resupply and medical evacuation operations. The 800 Algerian troops had constructed defensive positions that utilized the terrain's natural advantages while incorporating lessons learned from previous Indochina combat, but their equipment and ammunition supplies were limited by airlift capacity that required continuous operations under increasingly dangerous conditions. The 5th Vietnamese Parachute Battalion held Anne Marie on the northwestern perimeter, where Major Marcel Bigard's paratroopers maintained the most exposed position in the French defensive complex. Their location provided early warning of Viet Minh movements from the mountains, but also placed them within range of enemy artillery that could target their positions with accuracy that French counter-battery fire couldn't neutralize due to the concealment and mobility advantages that mountainous terrain provided to attacking forces. French air support included fighter bombers and transport aircraft operating from bases in the Red River Delta, but their effectiveness was limited by weather conditions, fuel constraints, and increasingly effective Viet Minh anti-aircraft capabilities that included 37mm guns whose range and accuracy threatened French aircraft throughout their approach and departure phases. The air support missions required careful coordination with artillery fire to avoid fratricidal incidents while maximizing tactical effectiveness against enemy positions that were often concealed in vegetation or underground facilities. The garrison's logistical requirements included daily resupply of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and personnel replacements that exceeded the capacity of available transport aircraft while operating under combat conditions that made landing operations increasingly hazardous. Each C-47 transport could deliver approximately 3 tons of supplies, but required clear weather and secured airfield conditions that Viet Minh artillery fire was designed to prevent through systematic targeting of runway facilities and aircraft on the ground. Medical facilities within the fortress complex included a surgical hospital established in underground bunkers, where Major Paul Grauwin commanded medical personnel whose training encompassed combat trauma treatment under siege conditions. The medical staff included French military surgeons, Vietnamese medical assistants, and support personnel whose capabilities would be tested by casualty rates and injury patterns that exceeded previous Indochina combat experience while operating under bombardment that threatened medical facilities and evacuation procedures. Communication systems linking the strong points to Central Command included field telephone lines that were vulnerable to artillery fire and radio equipment whose effectiveness was limited by mountainous terrain that disrupted signal transmission while providing concealment for Viet Minh forces whose own communication capabilities exceeded French intelligence estimates. The communication network required continuous maintenance under combat conditions that made repair operations extremely dangerous for personnel exposed to enemy observation and fire. The Viet Minh siege preparations had been conducted with operational security that prevented French intelligence from accurately assessing the scale and sophistication of artillery positions that General Giap's forces had established in the hills surrounding the valley. The communist artillery included weapons and ammunition that had been transported across hundreds of kilometers of mountain terrain through logistical operations that demonstrated organizational capabilities far exceeding what French colonial experience had attributed to indigenous military forces. French intelligence assessments had identified Viet Minh artillery as limited to mortars and recoilless rifles, but the actual communist firepower included 105mm howitzers, 75mm pack guns, multiple rocket launchers, and anti-aircraft weapons whose range and accuracy would dominate French positions from firing locations that provided natural protection while offering commanding observation of the entire valley floor, where French defensive positions were exposed to direct observation and accurate fire direction. The fortress's ammunition storage included artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and explosives that represented the garrison's combat effectiveness, but which also created vulnerability to enemy fire that could detonate stored munitions while destroying weapons and equipment that couldn't be replaced through airlift operations. The ammunition dumps required protection that competed with personnel requirements for defensive positions while creating additional targets that enemy artillery could engage with devastating effects. Weather conditions during mid-March included the transition from dry to wet season that would affect aircraft operations, ground movement, and living conditions within the fortress, while influencing tactical developments that could favor either French defensive capabilities or Viet Minh assault operations, depending on how atmospheric conditions affected artillery accuracy, air support effectiveness, and personnel morale throughout extended siege operations. Local Vietnamese personnel within the fortress included interpreters, laborers, and support staff whose loyalty remained uncertain, while their knowledge of local terrain and Viet Minh capabilities could provide intelligence that might influence tactical decisions. The presence of indigenous personnel created security concerns regarding information that could reach enemy forces while providing cultural insights that French commanders generally dismissed as irrelevant to military operations. As Viet Minh artillery preparation commenced with concentrated bombardment that exceeded every French expectation for enemy firepower and accuracy, the garrison faced combat conditions that would test whether European military technology and tactics could prevail against Asian revolutionary warfare supported by communist logistics and motivated by nationalist ideology that provided spiritual as well as material foundations for resistance that transcended normal military calculations. At 1700 hours on March 13th, as Viet Minh artillery opened concentrated fire against Strongpoint Beatrice with accuracy that indicated precise range cards and detailed target intelligence, French observers reported visual phenomena that their military training couldn't explain, but which seemed to intensify as the bombardment continued, and Vietnamese assault forces prepared to attack French positions that were being systematically destroyed by communist firepower that exceeded all intelligence estimates. Major Peugeot's communications with Central Command included reports of atmospheric disturbances that affected radio transmission while creating optical effects that enhanced visibility for French defensive fire, but which also seemed to provide concealment for Vietnamese forces moving through terrain that should have offered no protection against observation from French positions. The atmospheric phenomena included heat distortions that created mirages and visual anomalies, despite air temperatures that shouldn't have produced such effects. French artillery observers reported difficulties in directing counter-battery fire against Viet Minh positions that appeared to be protected by natural concealment, but which also seemed to benefit from environmental conditions that deflected French shells or reduced their explosive effectiveness when they impacted near communist artillery emplacements. The targeting problems occurred despite clear weather and excellent visibility that should have facilitated accurate fire direction against enemy positions. More significantly, French personnel throughout the fortress complex began observing luminous effects in the vegetation surrounding Viet Minh positions that created illumination patterns different from normal muzzle flashes or artillery impacts. The luminous phenomena appeared to move through the jungle in organized formations that suggested coordinated activity, but which didn't correspond to known Vietnamese tactical procedures or equipment that could produce such visual effects. Captain Touret's artillery coordination experienced systematic interference that prevented effective counter-battery missions despite accurate location data for enemy positions. French artillery shells appeared to detonate prematurely or failed to achieve expected destructive effects against Viet Minh emplacements whose protective capabilities exceeded what natural terrain features could provide against high explosive projectiles delivered with precision that should have neutralized enemy artillery positions. The medical personnel under Major Grauwin began treating French casualties whose wounds displayed characteristics that challenged conventional understanding of artillery and small arms trauma. Some French wounded exhibited healing rates that exceeded normal medical expectations, while others described encounters with Vietnamese personnel whose appearance and capabilities didn't correspond to known Viet Minh forces, but who had provided medical assistance that enhanced survival rates beyond what battlefield medicine could normally achieve. Local Vietnamese staff within the fortress reported observing activities in the surrounding hills that involved luminous figures who appeared to be coordinating with Viet Minh forces while displaying capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations. These individuals wore traditional Vietnamese clothing, but carried weapons and equipment that combined historical designs with characteristics that suggested supernatural enhancement of normal military effectiveness. The most disturbing reports came from French patrols that had been sent to investigate Viet Minh positions and had encountered resistance from Vietnamese forces whose tactics and equipment exceeded intelligence assessments while demonstrating knowledge of French defensive preparations that suggested intelligence-gathering capabilities beyond what normal reconnaissance could have achieved. The patrol members described engaging enemies who appeared to anticipate French movements while coordinating their own operations through methods that didn't rely on conventional military communication systems. French forward observers reported that Viet Minh artillery fire was being directed with accuracy that implied real-time observation of French positions from vantage points that surveillance couldn't identify despite extensive reconnaissance of the surrounding terrain. The enemy fire control demonstrated knowledge of French defensive layouts, ammunition storage locations, and personnel positions that exceeded what external observation could have provided through normal intelligence collection methods. The atmospheric effects intensified as evening approached, creating conditions where sound transmission carried Vietnamese communications across distances that should have prevented French forces from intercepting enemy radio traffic. The intercepted communications included tactical coordination that used terminology and procedures that didn't correspond to known Vietnamese military doctrine, while demonstrating organizational capabilities that exceeded what communist forces were supposed to possess. More alarming were French casualties, who reported encounters with burning figures who had appeared during Vietnamese assault operations to provide assistance to Viet Minh forces while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded normal human performance. These entities appeared to be immune to French weapons fire while possessing knowledge of French positions and weaknesses that enabled Vietnamese forces to achieve tactical successes that conventional military analysis couldn't explain. French chaplains conducting religious services for the garrison reported spiritual experiences that exceeded normal military religious observance, while providing insights into the cultural and spiritual dimensions of Vietnamese resistance that French colonial attitudes had dismissed as primitive superstition. The chaplains documented increased religious observance among French forces that attributed their survival to divine protection, while acknowledging that Vietnamese forces appeared to possess spiritual resources that enhanced their military capabilities. Belgian and French medical personnel treating both French and Vietnamese wounded reported healing phenomena that challenged medical understanding while producing therapeutic effects that exceeded what conventional treatment could achieve. Vietnamese casualties demonstrated recovery rates and pain tolerance that suggested medical knowledge and therapeutic techniques that European medicine hadn't documented, while some French wounded who had been treated by Vietnamese medical personnel showed improvement that exceeded normal healing processes. The cumulative effect of these anomalies created operational conditions that challenged French tactical doctrine while suggesting that Vietnamese forces possessed capabilities that extended beyond conventional military training and equipment. The supernatural elements appeared to enhance Viet Minh effectiveness while providing spiritual inspiration that transcended normal military morale and created psychological advantages that complemented their material superiority in artillery and personnel. As night fell on March 13th and Viet Minh forces prepared to launch their assault against Strongpoint Beatrice, French commanders faced tactical developments that exceeded their training and experience while confronting an enemy whose capabilities appeared to include supernatural assistance that enhanced their already formidable conventional military advantages. At 19:30 hours on March 13, as Viet Minh infantry began their assault on Strongpoint Beatrice following the devastating artillery preparation that had reduced French defensive positions to rubble-filled craters, Lieutenant Jean-Claude Carrière of the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion experienced the first documented direct encounter with the supernatural entity that Vietnamese forces would later identify as the burning spirit of resistance who had manifested to ensure victory against foreign occupation forces whose presence violated the sacred soil of Vietnamese ancestors. The assault commenced with human wave tactics that sent Vietnamese infantry across the approaches to Beatrice in coordinated formations that demonstrated training and discipline exceeding what French intelligence had attributed to peasant forces, but which also included tactical coordination that appeared to be directed by an individual whose presence on the battlefield defied every principle of combat leadership, while inspiring Viet Minh forces to achieve assault effectiveness that transcended normal military capabilities. Carrière's observation post provided commanding views of the Vietnamese assault formations when he first observed the figure that would haunt French survivors for decades following the battle's conclusion. The entity appeared as a human form engulfed in flames that provided illumination across the battlefield while remaining unaffected by French defensive fire that should have stopped any normal assault leader who exposed himself to concentrated machine gun and rifle fire from prepared defensive positions. The burning figure moved among Vietnamese assault troops while providing tactical direction that enhanced their assault effectiveness through guidance that appeared to anticipate French defensive responses before they could be implemented. The entity's tactical knowledge exceeded what battlefield observation could have provided, while demonstrating intimate familiarity with French defensive preparations, weapons positions, and command structures that intelligence gathering couldn't have acquired through normal reconnaissance methods. More extraordinary was the discovery that the burning figure appeared to be immune to French weapons fire while possessing the ability to neutralize French defensive systems through methods that challenged every understanding of combat physics and ballistics. French machine guns malfunctioned when directed at the entity, while artillery fire appeared to have no effect despite direct impacts that should have destroyed any normal target within the explosive radius of high explosive shells. Major Pegot's command bunker received reports from multiple defensive positions that confirmed the presence of the burning entity while documenting tactical developments that exceeded normal combat parameters. Vietnamese assault forces demonstrated coordination and timing that suggested supernatural enhancement of their tactical capabilities while maintaining human characteristics that distinguished them from the burning figure who appeared to provide spiritual inspiration rather than direct combat participation. The entity's influence extended beyond tactical guidance to include effects on French personnel that challenged medical understanding while producing psychological impacts that transcended normal combat stress. French defenders reported experiencing fear that exceeded normal battlefield anxiety, while simultaneously observing enhanced performance by Vietnamese forces that appeared to draw strength and courage from proximity to the burning figure whose presence inspired tactical effectiveness that exceeded normal military training. French casualties from the Beatrice assault displayed wound patterns that included burns that couldn't be explained through normal weapons effects or explosive devices that Vietnamese forces were known to possess. The burn injuries appeared to result from contact with intense heat sources that didn't correspond to any known military weapons while producing therapeutic effects that accelerated healing rates for Vietnamese wounded who had been in proximity to the burning entity. Captain Michel Desmarais, commanding the defensive positions on Beatrice's eastern perimeter, provided the most detailed account of direct interaction with the burning figure when his position was overrun by Vietnamese assault forces whose attack was led by the supernatural entity. Desmarais reported that the burning figure communicated through methods that transcended normal speech while conveying tactical information that proved accurate when Vietnamese forces implemented assault procedures that the entity had predicted. The communication occurred through means that Desmarais described as direct mental transmission that bypassed normal language barriers while providing information in Vietnamese, French, and other languages simultaneously. The entity's message emphasized that Vietnamese resistance to foreign occupation possessed spiritual dimensions that transcended military calculations, while warning that continued French resistance would encounter supernatural opposition that exceeded conventional military capabilities. More significantly, the burning figure demonstrated the ability to provide protection for Vietnamese assault forces while simultaneously offering mercy to French defenders who acknowledged the legitimacy of Vietnamese independence. Desmarais reported that French personnel who showed respect for Vietnamese sovereignty received protection from the entity's influence, while those who maintained colonial attitudes experienced psychological and physical effects that impaired their combat effectiveness. Vietnamese assault forces attacking Beatrice displayed tactical coordination that appeared to be enhanced through supernatural communication with the burning entity whose guidance allowed them to anticipate French defensive responses while exploiting weaknesses that normal reconnaissance couldn't have identified. The Vietnamese troops demonstrated courage and determination that exceeded normal military training while maintaining discipline and tactical effectiveness that suggested supernatural inspiration. The assault's climax occurred when the burning figure led Vietnamese forces in the final assault against Major Pagot's command bunker, demonstrating capabilities that included immunity to French weapons while possessing the ability to neutralize French defensive systems through methods that exceeded technological understanding. French defensive positions experienced systematic equipment failures that prevented effective resistance, while Vietnamese forces achieved breakthrough that captured the strong point. French survivors of the Beatrice assault reported that the burning entity had provided tactical guidance to Vietnamese forces throughout the engagement, while simultaneously offering protection to French personnel who acknowledged Vietnamese rights to independence and sovereignty. The entity's intervention appeared designed to minimize casualties while ensuring Vietnamese tactical success through supernatural assistance that complemented conventional military capabilities. Major Pagot's final radio transmission to Central Command confirmed the loss of Strongpoint Beatrice while reporting encounters with supernatural entities whose capabilities exceeded French defensive preparations. His message emphasized that Vietnamese forces possessed spiritual resources that enhanced their conventional military advantages, while suggesting that continued French resistance would face opposition that transcended normal military limitations. The fall of Beatrice within hours of the Viet Minh assault's commencement demonstrated that French defensive preparations were inadequate against enemy forces whose capabilities included supernatural assistance that enhanced their already superior conventional military advantages. The burning entity had established precedent for divine intervention that would influence subsequent tactical developments, while inspiring Vietnamese forces with confidence that their cause possessed spiritual legitimacy that transcended French colonial authority and military technology. The climactic phase of supernatural intervention at Dien Bien Phu commenced on March 30th during the Viet Minh assault on Strong Point Gabriel, when the burning entity manifested with intensity that illuminated the entire valley while coordinating Vietnamese forces in the most devastating display of supernatural warfare documented in modern military history. The entity's appearance during this critical engagement transcended individual tactical assistance to encompass battlefield dominance that challenged every assumption about the relationship between spiritual forces and military conflict. Colonel de Castries observed the phenomenon from his command bunker as the burning figure appeared simultaneously at multiple locations across the Gabriel perimeter, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded physical limitations while maintaining tactical coordination that suggested supernatural command structures operating beyond normal military organization. The entity's manifestation created luminous effects that enhanced visibility for Vietnamese forces while producing optical distortions that disrupted French defensive fire control and artillery targeting systems. The burning entity's influence extended to French personnel throughout the fortress complex, creating psychological effects that transcended normal combat stress while producing enhanced awareness of Vietnamese cultural and spiritual perspectives that challenged colonial attitudes and assumptions. French officers reported experiencing involuntary understanding of Vietnamese history, language, and spiritual beliefs that provided context for the resistance they were facing while acknowledging the legitimacy of Vietnamese independence aspirations. Lieutenant Colonel Gaucher's 7th Algerian Rifle Regiment defending Gabriel encountered Vietnamese assault forces whose capabilities had been enhanced beyond normal military training through supernatural inspiration provided by the burning entity whose presence created tactical conditions that favored Vietnamese operations while systematically degrading French defensive effectiveness. The Algerian troops reported experiencing equipment malfunctions that prevented effective resistance, while Vietnamese forces demonstrated coordination that exceeded their training and experience. The supernatural intervention reached unprecedented intensity when the burning entity began actively neutralizing French artillery and air support through methods that challenged every understanding of electromagnetic warfare and atmospheric physics. French artillery shells detonated prematurely or failed to explode when directed at Vietnamese positions where the entity was present, while aircraft attempting to provide close air support experienced engine failures and navigation difficulties that forced emergency landings or withdrawal from the target area. French medical personnel treating casualties from the Gabriel assault documented injuries that included burns that appeared to result from contact with supernatural heat sources whose temperatures exceeded what conventional weapons could produce. However, these burns demonstrated healing properties that accelerated recovery while providing pain relief that exceeded what military medical training could explain through normal therapeutic procedures. The most extraordinary development occurred when the burning entity demonstrated the ability to communicate directly with French commanders through methods that bypassed normal communication systems while providing detailed intelligence about French defensive capabilities, ammunition reserves, and morale conditions that exceeded what battlefield observation could have revealed. The entity's communications emphasized that continued French resistance was futile while offering terms for surrender that would minimize casualties on both sides. Vietnamese forces attacking Gabriel displayed tactical effectiveness that appeared to be coordinated through supernatural communication networks that allowed instantaneous coordination across the entire assault front while maintaining individual initiative that reflected enhanced training and motivation. The Vietnamese troops demonstrated courage and tactical skill that exceeded normal military capabilities while maintaining discipline that suggested supernatural inspiration rather than conventional military indoctrination. Captain André Botella, commanding French positions on Gabriel's northern perimeter, reported direct confrontation with the burning entity when his defensive position was targeted for elimination by Vietnamese forces whose assault was personally led by the supernatural figure. Botella described engaging an opponent whose capabilities transcended human limitations while possessing tactical knowledge that exceeded what any normal military commander could have acquired through conventional training and experience. The confrontation between Botella and the burning entity revealed the supernatural figure's ability to neutralize French weapons while demonstrating mercy that reflected spiritual rather than military objectives. The entity disabled Botella's defensive systems without causing personal injury while providing tactical guidance that allowed his surviving personnel to withdraw to secondary positions where they could continue resistance without facing annihilation. The burning entity's intervention at Gabriel included protective effects that extended to French personnel who demonstrated respect for Vietnamese cultural and spiritual traditions while maintaining opposition to those French commanders whose colonial attitudes prevented acknowledgement of Vietnamese rights to independence and self-determination. The selective protection suggested supernatural justice that transcended military considerations while influencing tactical outcomes through spiritual criteria. French air support attempting to engage Vietnamese positions where the burning entity was present reported encounters with atmospheric phenomena that exceeded meteorological understanding while producing effects that protected Vietnamese forces from aerial bombardment. Pilot reports described encountering thermal barriers that prevented effective weapons delivery while experiencing navigation difficulties that forced mission termination despite clear weather and optimal flying conditions. The psychological impact of supernatural intervention affected French morale throughout the fortress complex, while simultaneously inspiring Vietnamese forces with confidence that their cause possessed divine approval and spiritual support that guaranteed ultimate victory regardless of immediate tactical setbacks. French personnel reported experiencing depression and fatigue that exceeded normal combat stress, while Vietnamese forces demonstrated energy and determination that appeared to increase rather than diminish despite prolonged combat operations. The climax of supernatural intervention occurred when the burning entity appeared above the battlefield in a manifestation that was visible to personnel throughout the valley, while communicating a message that emphasized Vietnamese spiritual authority over their ancestral homeland and the inevitability of French defeat regardless of material advantages or tactical preparations. The message was received simultaneously by French and Vietnamese forces through direct spiritual transmission that transcended language barriers, while conveying political and spiritual meanings that challenged French colonial assumptions. As dawn approached on March 31st and Strong Point, Gabriel fell to Vietnamese forces whose assault had been enhanced by supernatural assistance that exceeded all military calculations. Colonel de Castries faced the reality that his garrison was confronting an enemy whose capabilities included divine intervention that guaranteed Vietnamese victory, while offering French forces the choice between surrender with honor or continued resistance that would result in complete annihilation through supernatural as well as conventional military means. The fall of Strong Point Gabriel marked the decisive turning point in the siege of Dien Bien Phu, not merely through conventional military analysis, but through the demonstration that Vietnamese forces possessed supernatural assistance that rendered French defensive preparations meaningless, while inspiring Viet Minh troops with confidence that their cause enjoyed divine protection that guaranteed ultimate victory regardless of French technological advantages or tactical innovations. Major Grouin's medical facilities experienced an unprecedented influx of French casualties whose wounds included burns that defied medical explanation, while simultaneously demonstrating healing properties that accelerated recovery rates beyond what conventional treatment could achieve. French wounded who had encountered the burning entity reported reduced pain, enhanced tissue regeneration, and psychological recovery that exceeded normal trauma treatment while providing spiritual insights that challenged their understanding of the conflict's moral dimensions. The psychological impact on French forces throughout the remaining strongpoints created morale problems that transcended normal combat stress, while producing acknowledgement among French personnel that Vietnamese resistance possessed legitimacy that colonial propaganda had denied. French officers reported increased discussion among troops about the justice of Vietnamese independence aspirations, while questioning whether continued resistance served honorable military objectives or merely prolonged suffering for political purposes that lacked moral foundation. Vietnamese casualties treated in French medical facilities demonstrated recovery rates that exceeded normal healing processes while displaying pain tolerance and spiritual composure that challenged Western medical understanding. Vietnamese wounded reported receiving guidance from spiritual sources that provided comfort and strength beyond what medical treatment could offer, while some described direct communication with ancestral spirits who encouraged continued resistance until complete independence was achieved. French artillery effectiveness decreased systematically throughout April as supernatural phenomena interfered with fire control systems while protecting Vietnamese positions from accurate bombardment that should have neutralized enemy artillery and assault preparations. French counter-battery missions failed to achieve expected results despite accurate target identification, while Vietnamese artillery demonstrated enhanced accuracy that exceeded normal fire control capabilities through guidance that appeared to utilize supernatural observation and targeting assistance. Air support operations became increasingly hazardous as French aircraft encountered atmospheric disturbances that affected navigation, weapons delivery, and engine performance when operating over areas where the burning entity had been observed. Pilot reports documented equipment malfunctions that occurred without mechanical explanation while experiencing psychological effects that included enhanced awareness of Vietnamese perspectives and growing reluctance to conduct bombing missions against civilian areas where non-combatants might be affected. The siege's psychological dimension evolved beyond conventional military stress to include spiritual experiences that affected French personnel regardless of their religious backgrounds or previous beliefs about supernatural phenomena. Catholic chaplains reported increased requests for religious services, while Protestant and secular personnel described spiritual encounters that provided insights into Vietnamese cultural and religious traditions that challenged colonial assumptions about indigenous spiritual practices. Local Vietnamese personnel remaining within the fortress complex reported receiving spiritual guidance that encouraged them to assist French wounded while simultaneously supporting Vietnamese military objectives through intelligence gathering and passive resistance activities. These individuals described communication with ancestral spirits who provided tactical information about French defensive weaknesses while emphasizing humanitarian obligations that transcended military and political divisions. French communication intercepts revealed that Vietnamese forces were receiving tactical coordination through methods that exceeded known radio procedures while demonstrating command and control capabilities that suggested supernatural communication networks. Viet Minh units displayed coordination that exceeded what normal military communication systems could achieve while maintaining operational security that prevented French intelligence from identifying command structures or intercepting tactical instructions. The fortress's ammunition storage experienced systematic detonation that appeared to result from supernatural rather than conventional sabotage, as explosions occurred without evidence of Vietnamese infiltration or artillery impacts that could account for the destruction of critical supplies. French ordnance disposal personnel couldn't explain the detonation patterns, while Vietnamese forces demonstrated knowledge of French ammunition status that exceeded what normal intelligence gathering could have provided. Medical personnel from both sides reported encounters with spiritual entities that provided healing assistance during the most critical phases of medical treatment while transcending national and political boundaries to focus on humanitarian objectives that reflected spiritual rather than military priorities. These supernatural medical interventions enhanced recovery rates for both French and Vietnamese casualties while demonstrating divine compassion that exceeded human understanding. French defensive positions experienced equipment failures that followed patterns suggesting systematic supernatural interference rather than normal mechanical breakdown or Vietnamese sabotage. Weapons, communication systems, and defensive infrastructure malfunctioned in ways that prevented effective resistance while avoiding casualties that would have resulted from conventional sabotage operations, suggesting supernatural intervention designed to minimize violence while ensuring Vietnamese tactical success. The fortress's water supply remained adequate despite Vietnamese control of external sources, apparently through supernatural intervention that prevented French forces from experiencing dehydration while maintaining sanitary conditions that prevented disease outbreaks that normal siege conditions would have produced. The continued availability of clean water suggested divine protection that extended to basic humanitarian needs, despite military circumstances that should have created critical shortages. As May approached, and the Geneva Conference prepared to address Indochina's political future, French forces at Dien Bien Phu faced the reality that their military situation had been determined by supernatural intervention that guaranteed Vietnamese victory while offering lessons about colonial relationships and indigenous rights that challenged fundamental assumptions about European authority in Asia and the spiritual dimensions of resistance movements that drew strength from cultural and religious sources that foreign powers couldn't comprehend or defeat through conventional military means. The Burning Entity's intervention had transformed the siege from a conventional military engagement into a spiritual conflict where Vietnamese forces possessed divine assistance that rendered French technological advantages meaningless while demonstrating that independence movements rooted in cultural authenticity and spiritual legitimacy could overcome foreign occupation regardless of material disadvantages or conventional military assessments that failed to account for supernatural factors that transcended normal strategic calculations.